And the other thing I wanted to talk about is just how history, some of our history in the United States affects modern life. And so some of you may be aware of the civil rights movement from the 60s, where, a long time ago, it's not even that long ago, but several decades ago, African Americans like myself were not able to eat at certain restaurants. They were not able to attend certain schools. So for example, my parents went to segregated schools. It means that there were only African Americans at their school, Black Americans were at their school, and then white Americans went to a different school and they could not go to the same schools. So this was just one generation before me, and there were lots of other laws and regulations. And over time, that has transitioned. The government made changes. There are laws prohibiting those kinds of, or preventing those kinds of, we call it segregation. So people are supposed to have equal rights according to the law. It does not always happen, but legally now all Americans have equal rights, the same rights in terms of race and ethnicity. So that affects our present day, because if you visit the United States, you might find that some people are sensitive about race and talking about race and our culture, because it has such a strong history, such a a very hard history. It was tough for many people to just get jobs, to support their families. So this has carried over into our modern day life. For example, even though I was not alive I was born after integration, after laws changed, but because my parents grew up in that environment, they talked to my sister and I a lot about making sure that we had the best opportunities so that we didn't have to have the same kind of challenges that they had when they were growing up. And one other thing that I found interesting when I came to Colombia, that a lot of African Americans and just Americans in general are very sensitive about, is blackface. So this is when someone who has light skin will put brown or black makeup on their face, and the reason it is very offensive for us in the United States is because many years ago, this is how white actors would dress themselves to portray African Americans, and it was always in a way that was derogatory. It means it was always in a way that was negative. They portrayed black people as uneducated, as in just a very negative way. So for us in our culture, and because of the history of our country, this has a very negative meaning and feeling, and it makes us feel bad. And so here in Colombia, I know that there are people who put on blackface for Carnival, for example. I came around Carnival time, and the first time I saw that, I thought, what is this? This is so uncomfortable for me. But I know that the history of that blackface here in Colombia is different than the history of blackface in the United States. But if you were ever to visit the United States, it would be something that would be good to know, so that if, for example, you were to show pictures to your American friends of Carnival and there were people dressed in blackface, it's good to be aware that it is not something that would be seen as positive for Americans, even though it's not a negative, it does not have that negative sense, that negative meaning in Colombian culture, as I've been told.
It is good in the same sense that Barack Obama being the first African American president is symbolically important, and it allows black people in the United States to aspire a little bit more because they see people like them reflected in positions in power, and that can give them more.
Do you think something changed really for black people with the United States president is black?
Yeah, well, it opened the discussion about racism and race relations in the United States back up again, because at first Barack Obama was elected, and then a lot of people thought we're completely done with racism and racial inequality because we've elected a black president. And a lot of people felt good about that. And then after a while, it became clear that that wasn't the case, that there was still a lot of inequality and a lot of discrimination. And if you are paying any attention to the news at this time in the United States, then there's a lot of stories about racial inequality, specifically about black people being killed unjustly by the police, which is still a huge problem. And one thing that's interesting, talking with people in Colombia about racism, a lot of people that I've talked to feel like there's not racism, or not very much racism in Colombia. And I don't think that's true. I think there's definitely differences in opportunity, differences in people having opportunity for jobs or having money. I mean, there's not that many Afro-Colombian students here at Uni Norte. And I think that's like a issue of opportunity. But I think the reason why a lot of Colombians don't see there being a big problem with racial injustice is because there's not the history of extreme racial violence like there is in the United States. So from the beginning, when there were slaves in the United States, there was maybe a 20-year period after slavery where called Reconstruction, where black people in the South became congressmen and became business leaders, and that upset some people. So then there were a lot of laws enacted to stop that from happening, and to keep black people from being able to vote, mostly, and hold political office. And there was a lot of violence against black people because poor whites felt threatened by black people because they were basically in similar economic status, and they were basically competing for jobs or land that was still held by a group of wealthier people. So, and there's a lot of really interesting documentaries and books about that, about race relations historically in the United States. But basically that continued up. The last time when it was a really major nationwide issue was during the 60s, and the social justice movements tied with Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And there were a lot of laws that changed because of that. There was school integration. A lot of the voting laws that were prohibiting black people from voting were done away with. And so there was major progress. But there is still not really any meaningful change in economic opportunities. And that actually goes back to the school board issue of how to, because there's a school district, which is like a small area within any city, and the school board controls the schools in that district. And the districts get money based on the property values. So if you live in a nice neighborhood, then your school has lots of money. But if you live in a poor neighborhood, then your school has no money. So you get a worse education, so then your opportunities are limited because other people learn things that you didn't. And so that continued, and that still is a problem. But recently, and I guess it's technology, people filming police with their cell phones is what started this conversation, because there's so much evidence now of police officers abusing their power, especially with young black people. So that's pretty depressing.
Yeah.